я не марю, а не мелилю, да сау la lesto la pavo, da sau la lesto la pavo, yo da an dve trejo stoletja.
When I think of Marija, I am filled with the largeness of her presence. She was very full person, not just full-bodied, but full. There was an electricity, an energy about her. And I think of how she projected and welcomed me into her presence, and her eyes twinkled, and she had, there was something so expansive about it, nothing that was, that made me feel larger. It made me feel that I had entered into a spacious world, the world of her imagination and generosity. I mean, she had a very rich and vivid imagination, and as well as all these facts. So she she didn't always do goddess things. She had done many years of scholarship. In which she worked on folklore and she worked on linguistic things, and then she finally got to do archaeology in the field, and that's when she began to uncover these figurines. And what she said was that they're small, usually maybe 5-6 inches at the most, and they would be broken off. And she said that the male archaeologists or the other people in the field would just throw them out, as they were always looking for gold or big things or stone sculptures or something like that. So, but she realized soon that there were hundreds, thousands of them. She said that at the time, this is what she told me this the first time I saw her, that there were 100,000 artifacts from the period in which she was working. All right, so I'm sure today there are many more, but that the idea that there was so much of this, and that these were totally discounted, and if anyone paid any attention to them, they referred to them as toys. When I hear anyone talk about these things as toys, if I were to see in some museum display, they're described as toys. It's the thing that kind of makes my blood pressure raise, because these people didn't make toys. I mean, these prehistoric people. If they made any, and they didn't do anything without some reason. And most of what they did or made or their activity was all involved with the sacred. Now, I had no trouble knowing that these were deities, because I'd already been in India and worked in India, and where they have, and the small terracotta figurines aren't referred to as toys, at least, I mean, no matter what they're the gods and goddesses. So not that some Western scholars, when they first went to India, didn't call them toys, but no one anymore calls them toys. So I could see that the same thing then was happening in what Marija called Old Europe, that the people who, as votive objects, as their need, people have a need to have something object to relate to, so they would shape and form this so that it would give visual expression to the mythology and the ritual that they were involved in. I had read her book, the one that came out, called The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, which is her major publication at that time. But in there I saw some of the Vinca small goddess figurines. And I had one from India that was from the early 20th century, from Bengal. And it was morphologically, that is, it more or less looked the same. And not exactly the same, but certainly resembled. There was such a strong resemblance. And this was of the goddess Shasti, who was the goddess of childbirth in Bengal. So I was struck by this. So I wanted to discuss this. Well, this is one of the things I wanted to talk about with Marija, because how I felt perhaps there was something just in the very nature of the devotion to the goddess that would have women, and perhaps men too, make small votive images as part of their ritual of devotion, which is what they do in India. So I don't know that Marija ever talked about that. She really wasn't terribly interested, or even interested at all, in making these kinds of comparisons with the living tradition of the goddess in India. And I, who always ached to discuss that with her, felt that she had such an enormous amount of material that she was working with, that she had just drawn boundaries around what it is she wanted to look at and wasn't willing to go out, or wasn't interested in going outside of those boundaries. The world that she, although it was very large and long over millennia, still it was bounded by being part of Europe and touching perhaps on the Near East, but basically she dealt with a certain part of Europe. And I, on the other hand, had posited, I won't say that I had done it then, but certainly I have now, that there's an underlying strata which is pre what we call Indo-European, in which there are all kinds of correspondences, both in the mythology and in the kind of iconography of the images that they made, and probably in the ritual as well. So what I am trying to do now in my current research is to go back to India to look in the villages where the oldest layer of goddess worship is still alive. And this is the bedrock of the culture of the village, the focus of the village, is the devotion to what is called the Grama Devi, the village goddess. And interestingly, her primal form is not anthropomorphic. It's either a tree or a rock or a mountain, but actually the mountain is further away. So more specifically, they would honor the Devi, their village goddess, and every village has one, maybe more than one, at a tree, a stone under a tree, and she would be at the boundary of the village, and the village is her territory. She is very territorial. She is the protector of that village. And in my interviews with the villagers are just wonderful, because for them she's very much alive. They envision her as a human, in human form, and she's there for them. She hears their stories, she listens to them, she hears what they want. She can't always help them, but she always listens. And then one offering that they make, widely made to her, is a terracotta horse. So you see these small terracotta horses underneath the tree by the stone. And they say she gets on the horse at night and rides all around the village to see that everyone's all right. And some of them have said if you take a walk early in the morning, just when the light is changing at that, liminal time between the night and day, you can see a light at the end of the road, and that she's coming back to her shrine. And what they do in devotion is to smear the rock or the tree with red color, cinder or vermilion, and they also sometimes dress it in a piece of sari cloth. What's happening is that you can see in the villages where I am the transition as first there is no shrine at all, then they build a little cement enclosure, and then eventually they will have a small structure, and priests will come in then. They won't be Brahmin priests. There'll be other gardeners or tribals or somebody like that who will officiate, and then, but still, once you have a priest there saying something, even if it's sort of nonsensical Sanskrit, that doesn't make any sense, still it's no longer unmediated. So the beauty of the primal form is that there's no one between the devotee, who are men and women, and the goddess. But then a further transformation comes when the Brahmins take over, and they do what's called a yajna, which is a Vedic kind of sacrifice with fire. And they use Sanskrit, it's language and mantras, and they also the ritual is, let's find the word for it. It's established, it's set, it's not informal anymore. There's a formal ritual, and they have this fire sacrifice. And they're talking then not about the individual village and the problems of the villagers there, but rather more universal things. So you can see that. So that's a process that's going on in the villages themselves. And what that does is diminish the power, the energy that the villager gets from the contact. What Marija did for me, and was centrally important, her work in the book that I wrote, because she supplied in her own scholarship and the books that became the language of the goddess and the civilization of the goddess, she set up a typology of the various forms that the goddess could take, the various manifestations, and what it all meant. And this then, because it was based on archaeological evidence, moved the story of the goddess from something that was hypothetical or so-called myth to something which had a material foundation. So that we then had an enormous body of evidence that said that this was the religion of the Neolithic people. Why the people are so resistant to this idea. Our whole way of being in the world, our whole life, our whole sense of ourself in this world is tied into this idea that God is one, that God is male, God is the Father, and God created everything. And we don't have to be fundamentalists to have this as some sort of lurking around in the back of our consciousness, even despite the fact that we have Darwin and science and everything else. These ideas are very persistent in our, at some deep level of our consciousness. So the idea that there was a goddess, the idea that life is not linear, that the world was created in one day and will end in the day of judgment, which is a linear way of looking at the world, but rather cyclical, which is the goddess tradition. One of the things that the feminists have done is to demonstrate how this has been done over and over again. So part of the feminist scholarly movement has been to reconstruct, reclaim what has been left out. And one area which I'm very familiar with is that of the women artists. Now we have evidence that there were women artists, well-known women artists at the courts of the major rulers of Europe in the 16th, 17th century, and yet there was no mention of them. Their names were totally lost, their personalities were lost, their paintings were ascribed to either their husbands or their fathers or their sons. And when just in the 70s, when we first began to think about this, we had articles like, why have there been no great women artists? And then two art historians decided to find out about this, and so they managed to find 500 famous women artists from the Renaissance to the 20th century. Fortunately, something is happening now, even in the scholarly world, which is that there is a body of publication coming out, which is called Alternate Ways of Knowing. And feminist thinking is one of these alternate ways of knowing. Another is that of the indigenous peoples. That's an alternate way of knowing. And this is where I think the goddess and the recognition of the goddess religion will find a niche for itself, at least in the beginning, in which there are more than one truth. And there are multiple, just as we live in a pluralistic society, we're forced to acknowledge that we aren't all white and that we have different cultures and different ways of learning, so that we will have different truths about what the nature of religion is and the religious experience. And that religion, or what we in the goddess tradition call the sacred, that this is foundational in the human existence. We've lived in a world in which the profane was acknowledged as the only reality, and the sacred and has another place, but it's not in the priority of things. It's the profane world where knowledge was supposed to have been generated. So again, in our alternate ways of knowing, we allow for the experiential, the shamanic, for instance, the mystical, many different ways of knowing, of understanding and experiencing. And that spirituality, for instance, which is very different than religion, is now a word that you hear that people are more comfortable with. It was a word that you couldn't use at all in the academic world. When I went to teach at the Harvard Divinity School, I was told that you can talk about anybody else's religious experience or spiritual experience, but you can't talk about your own. One of the things that feminists have brought into the discourse is the fact that not only can you talk about your own, but your own voice is important to talk about. The voice of your own experience, the embodied knowledge that you have. The resistance, again, isn't just within the meaning of these artifacts, because there is the tradition of iconographical analysis. You can analyze iconography, that is, these small artifacts, even though you don't have a written text. That was allowable in the domain of art history. But where Marija ran into was what she was claiming was that there was religion of the goddess. That's from my point of view. That's why there was so much resistance to what she was saying. And again, it comes to the fact that if you, at some level, think that God created everything and that God the Father, and monotheism, the idea that there's only one way, archaeologists, everyone would acknowledge that something went before the Hebrews. God arrived, but that was not considered not only not important, it was of a lower order, like primitive, or they would use the word, which is a put-down word, cult. I'm just reminded of the big furor there was in the first half of the 20th century over the cave paintings in the Paleolithic time, which is going back 40,000 years. And these brilliant, fabulous paintings of animals in movement, capturing the energy of the animals that were painted on cave walls deep inside the earth, in places where it would have been practically total darkness and difficult of access, the places that were the sanctuaries of our earliest human ancestors. That when these were first discovered, which was at the end of the 19th century, and people refused to believe that they were that old, because the idea was that we lived in this time of progress, that things got better and better all the time. Important, and certainly important for me in looking to Marija as a model, was her two things. One is her generosity of spirit, which is the kind of hospitality that she showed to anyone who came to her home, and her willingness to share, which included sharing of slides of visual materials for publications. She wasn't at all closed in terms of, there was nothing, she didn't ever strike me as being competitive in the way in which so many scholars are, or holding her knowledge sort of close to the chest and not letting people know what it is that she thought or knew. Another thing, I'm trying to find the right word for it, but it's her openness to letting in a growing awareness of herself as a spiritual being, which happened, I think, because of her life-threatening illnesses. But people can freeze up with fear. She didn't freeze up with fear. She just opened herself, opened her heart and her soul to another way of being. And I think that this informed and illuminated her scholarship, made her a larger person. At some level, no one likes to be all alone and isolated, which is how she did really feel. But on another level, she was such a strong woman. The word I always like to think of her is, I do it with the French pronunciation, is that she was formidable. That she was the strongest woman that I've ever encountered. And for me, she remains as a model. I mean, in my hours of weakness and despair, I think, oh, well, you know, Marija managed to push through. Not that I compare myself to her in my originality. I mean, she had this fabulously original mind to make what Vicki was describing as this synthesis of bringing together the various areas in which she was an expert, and being able, through the knowledge of both the folklore and the language and then of the archaeological evidence, to make some sense out of all this required what I would call a great leap of the imagination. Now, which is different than intuition, but she had to be able to imagine some way of putting all this together. And I remember that time, the first time I went to see her, which was probably 1986, when she had spread out on a long, long table what she called all the evidence. She said she had 800 various kinds of images that she was working with. And that, and maybe I think all 800 may have gotten into between the language of the goddess and the civilization of the goddess. She may have used all these 800, or almost all of them, but to have even the control and command over that array of material, takes this a formidable intelligence. And she believed in herself without any reservation. As far as I can tell, I wasn't her confidant, so I don't know that she didn't have her moments of doubt. She certainly, her own family life wasn't easy, and certainly the strength of character that it took during what she did during the Second World War, along with having 2 children. She managed to get a PhD while she was a refugee. And then she lived for 3 years on a 6th floor walk-up with 2 small children. Well, you know, there is a great deal of the women's movement is not women's spirituality. That's one piece of the women's movement. There are the large part of the women's movement in the United States and Europe and India is really not concerned at all with anything that they would call spirituality. They're Marxist-oriented, much more interested in material things and material gains. Now, not that we don't need that kind of energy also, but for me, the fullness of the possibility of women working for the transformation of culture and society, for justice, is when you take into account not just the material, but also the spiritual. So for the spiritual feminists, for those who would so identify, Marija is the pathfinder. Forces which really bode well for change in the 21st century are the women's spirituality movement and the ecological movement, and they intersect. So that, and both of them are global and plural in their foundation. Well, certainly her theory about regeneration, that life is cyclical, that it is a birth, death, and rebirth, is very important to understand in terms of the possibilities of even regeneration and all that we're losing ecologically with the various species. But also the understanding that the sacred is not up there in the sky, but is in the earth, and in the connections then and the ritual objects that she found, which really had to do with the forces of nature and the connection, that it isn't that nature and culture are separate, but that nature is part of culture, or culture is part of nature. And this is part of certainly the evidence from the Neolithic, what she calls Old Europe, in their ideas about the persona of the various deities, which have to do with the forces of nature, and deifying them and then reifying them through ritual. The connection then, we are disconnected. We're from the earth. We're disconnected from each other. We're alienated. And so she's describing a world in which people were very connected. They were connected to the life process. They were connected to the seasonal cycle. They were connected to the earth.